Now let's face the question of, if we know that legal incidence doesn't really matter for taxes and subsidies, what is it that really determines who gets the benefit or who bears the burden of a subsidy or tax? Right. And the answer is that when we look at who it is that actually bears the burden of a tax, right, is that it's all a matter of relative elasticity. So on the one hand, with legal incidence, that's really just determined by the law, right? And it tells us really just who's the one signing the check. Well, economic incidence, that is who bears the actual burden of a tax or who gets the actual benefit from a subsidy, right? That is determined by relative elasticity, right? Because really there we really need to ask the question of how much of the tax can be passed on to another party, or how much of the subsidy has to be passed on to another party, right? And that's going to be answered by elasticity. Now, in general, the more elastic one side of the market is or another, the less room there is for prices to change. Right? After all, if I say that the supply or demand is very elastic, what we really mean is that it's very responsive to price changes. So prices there aren't going to change very much. Right? If I try, say I'm a supplier and I'm getting taxed, if I try to pass this tax on to my buyers and demand is very elastic, they stop buying my product. So I don't have much room there to push this price over to the demand side. Or vice versa, right? If I am a demander and I'm being taxed, right, my ability to push that cost onto the supplier very much depends on how sensitive they are to the prices that I'm willing to pay them. If I'm willing to pay them slightly less and suddenly they don't want to sell me the product anymore, I really can't pass the tax on to them. On the other hand, if supplier demand is very inelastic, big price changes are possible on that side, right? So this ends up being the fundamental reason behind how the burden of a tax or the benefit of a subsidy gets divided. It's really all about elasticity. The result being that the less elastic side of the market is the one that's going to experience the bigger price change, and therefore they're the ones that are going to pay the majority of the tax or receive the majority of the subsidy. If the two sides are basically the same in terms of their elasticity, whether it's high or low, it doesn't really matter. What really matters is them relative to each other. If they're equally elastic or equally inelastic, then we would expect the tax or subsidy to be divided evenly between the two. But that's pretty rarely the case. So let's work through some examples just to show this. Consider tobacco farm subsidies. So who is it that really benefits? Well, let's assume that the demand for tobacco and tobacco products has an elasticity of something like 0.4. That is, for every 1% increase, there's a 0.4% decrease in the quantity that is demanded. Now, when we look at over the long term, including, say, the entire growing season for tobacco, the elasticity of the supply of tobacco is actually quite high. It's often estimated at being around 7 or 8. So if you increase the price of tobacco by 1%, the supply of tobacco will tend to increase by 7.6%, or the quantity supplied will increase by 7.6%. Right, so in this case, the supply side is far more sensitive to price changes than the demand side. So then we decide that, well, we really want to support tobacco farmers, and so we're going to have a subsidy. The question then is, who really benefits from it? Well, here it is honestly just a matter of looking at the two numbers. And we find out the elasticity for demand is far lower than the elasticity of supply, which means the demand side, the buyers, that are going to be the ones that benefit. We can actually make this numerically precise. Right? So it's the buyers that are going to benefit. They're the less elastic side of the market. Right? Now with these elasticities, it actually ends up that buyers get roughly 95% of the total benefit of any subsidy that happens. Right, so in order to figure that out, really all you have to do is take the elasticity for the opposing side. Right, so if we're talking about buyers, you look at the supply elasticity, divide that by the total of the two elasticities. So in this case, I took 7.6 divided by 8, and you end up with roughly 95%. Right? So that tells you how much of the benefit a particular side gets. So 95% of the benefit goes to the buyers of tobacco products. Only 5% of the benefit goes to the tobacco farmers or the suppliers of tobacco products. Right, the point here being, we really need to be careful about the way we design our subsidies and our taxes to make sure we're taxing who we want to tax and we're subsidizing who we want to subsidize. If we're not careful, we might end up subsidizing or taxing the wrong side of the market. As in this case, if the argument is we really need to support the farmers, and the farmers only get 5% of the benefit, we're really not accomplishing the goal that we had set out for ourselves. Now let's look at another example. Let's look at something like a jewelry tax. These types of luxury taxes are actually quite common to hear people propose because we like the idea of taxing the rich for the most part. Right? We know the rich don't need the money, they have plenty of money, they're going to survive either way, so let's go ahead and put a tax on something that mostly rich people are going to buy. But what is the actual consequence? Well, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the demand for jewelry is actually very elastic. Right? Let's say 2.5. 2.5 is actually not far off from some of the estimates you see for the demand for jewelry. Right? All that really means is that if there's a 1% increase in the price, there will be a 2.5% decrease in the quantity that is purchased. Now, the supply of jewelry will tend to be much less elastic, if only because it's very hard for us to produce, say, more gold rings, because it means digging gold out of the ground and getting it refined and processed and molded and all that. It's a difficult process, and the reality is there is only so much gold in the ground, and only a certain part of that is relatively easy to get to. At the same time, once we already have gold out of the ground, it's very difficult to destroy it. Right? As a result, the supply of jewelry we'd expect to be relatively more inelastic. Let's give it an elasticity of 0.5. 1% increase in the price of jewelry leads to a 0.5% increase in the quantity that is supplied. In that case, when we tax jewelry, who is it really going to hurt? Who is it that's going to pay the tax? Well, the reality is that suppliers are going to pay over 75% of the tax. 2.5 divided by 3, whatever that percentage is, that's the percentage suppliers have to pay. You'll find it's a little over 75%. So, what this really means is that when we put in this tax, because, we really want to tax the rich, these people that are buying jewelry, we're not actually taxing the people that are buying jewelry. Only about 25% of the impact ends up hitting that side of the market. Instead, we're taxing those that are providing jewelry to the market. So that's really who the tax is on. They're the ones that have to pay the burden. So it ends up, sometimes, as in this case, taxing the rich may not actually end up taxing the rich. After all, it is very easy for them to not buy a particular luxury good. Right? So jewelry has gotten too expensive, well, that's fine, we'll just take another trip to a resort. Right? That's the thing about these various luxuries, is that what makes them luxuries is that they're so easy to do without. It's the difference between a luxury and a necessity. Right? With necessities, it's very difficult to do without them. Right? And as a result, we'd expect, generally, the buyers to pay more of the taxes on necessities. Whereas with luxuries, it's very difficult to get the buyers to pay very much of the tax, as typically the supply side tends to be much less elastic than the demand side for luxuries. Now let's turn to a public finance principle that really comes out of this discussion of elasticity. That is that, as a matter of public policy, it's generally best to tax those goods where the elasticity of demand or the elasticity of supply is very low. Let's look at some of the reasons for that. Here, we're looking at the quantity effects in two different markets, the market for computers and the market for milk. Now, in both of them, I'm going to assume that the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply is equal, so any tax is going to get divided evenly between these two. Right, so, and I'm also making the two markets the same size. You see, say the price of computers before any tax is implemented is something like $500, while it's only $5 for a gallon of milk. But the quantities offset this. So $500,000 total is being spent on computers, $500,000 total is being spent on milk. Okay. Then we're thinking about a tax in these two different markets. And we made them proportional. So we're thinking about a $100 tax in the market of computers, it's roughly 20% of the price, and then a $1 tax on milk. And what are the effects in these two markets? Well, it ends up, when you do the math, you find out that the market for computers, because the elasticity is so high, it's 1.5 for demand and also 1.5 for supply, we get a substantial drop in quantity when we put in this kind of tax. In effect, what we would say is, one way we can get there, is saying, well, it's a $100 tax, the two elasticities are equal, so $50 are going to fall on each party. That's a 10% change. Now, a 10% increase in the price will lead to a 15% decrease in the quantity, given the numbers that we have here to work with, which means the quantity with the tax will drop to 850 from 1,000. Right. As a result, the tax revenue is only going to be $85,000. 850 multiplied by the tax gives us $85,000 of tax revenue. Now, in the market for milk, the quantity response is far smaller. After all, elasticity of demand and supply are far lower. Actually, 0.5, it ends up, is very, very close to the real estimates that you'll find, both on the demand and supply side. As a result, this $1 tax gets divided relatively evenly between the demanders and the suppliers of milk, right? So they each experience roughly a 10% either increase in the price that buyers have to pay or decrease in the price the sellers get to keep. So this 10% change leads to a 5% change in the amount that they're willing to buy or provide. As a result, we end up with 95,000 being the quantity after the tax. 95,000 multiplied by the dollar a piece, we end up raising just $95,000 of revenue. Now, what I really want to highlight here is this difference. It's that really, computers, we end up seeing a significantly larger quantity effect. That is, the quantity falls more substantially than in the milk market. Now, not in terms of number, but in terms of percentage. We get a 15% drop versus just a 5% drop. As a result, it ends up the tax revenue in the market for computers is far less reliable. Right? Now, one might blindly think, okay, 1,000 computers are traded. If we tax $100 a piece, that'll raise $100,000. It ends up we're off by $15,000 in this case, precisely because when we put the tax in, people don't buy as many computers. And they stop buying computers, it ends up relatively quickly, given these assumptions. Now with milk, it's still true, we don't raise $100,000 like we might have thought, but because people are less likely to cut back on their milk consumption, it ends up we raise a substantial portion of that $100,000 we may have expected. As a result, we're going to have more reliable tax revenue if we tax those things that have relatively inelastic demand or supply. So let's revisit that public finance principle just to lay out the reason for it. Just remember, we want to tax those goods where the elasticity of demand or the elasticity of supply is very low. Right? So where either demand or supply, either one, is not very responsive to changes in prices. If we do that, then it ends up that we're going to get very small effects on quantity from that tax, which means we'll have more reliable tax revenue, and we'll have smaller deviations from the social optimum. That is, our quantity won't fall very much, so we're not leading to a lot of inefficiency in the market. Whereas if demand and supply are very elastic, then we end up not raising very much revenue, in effect because we're going to kill off a good part of that market. And that's something that is not very efficient, it's not a good idea. It's a bad use of resources to kill off a market where the good is actually valued by the people.